All right, so we're moving on to policy. So we're focusing much more on our homes or our location here, New York City, in fact. So Sylvie Binder is going to be joining us, and she's city's policy advisor. And then we have Zach, who's following after, and he's with the mayor's office of New York City Development Corporation. Well, actually, why don't we have them introduce themselves? They're going to do a much better job. And so, why don't you come on up? The slides are all queued.
Hi, everyone. Good afternoon. I'm Sylvie Binder, a policy advisor at the New York City Mayor's Office of Climate and Environmental Justice. I focus on greenhouse gas emissions, kind of towing the line between operational carbon reduction and embodied carbon reduction. So happy to be here.
Hi there, I'm Marianne Jang. I'm a senior policy advisor at the Office of General Services for New York State. I will be moderating the session, so I'm going to hand over to my colleague, Zach.
Hi, Zach Aders. I'm a VP at the New York City Economic Development Corporation, oversee various public building projects for New York City agencies, and glad to be here.
All right, so I know, can you all hear me okay, like this? Okay. I know this conference so far hasn't really taken a policy bend, but I think that's going to be the purpose of this session. So I'll be hoping to give you some place setting on the New York City policy context for embodied carbon, and happy to take any questions after our panel today. The biggest piece of policy that New York City currently has on embodied carbon is Executive Order 23, the Clean Construction Executive Order. We have a few other policies that I'll be mentioning, highlighting as well, and an announcement that our office made just this week on A5 emissions, but I'll really be focusing on the executive order. So these are our policies. Kind of going in reverse order, we have our executive order, which was signed in 2022, which we are actively implementing. This executive order requires city capital project agencies to commit to lowering their embodied carbon in a few key areas, and some of them are listed here. The first two we've kind of found as low-hanging fruit, low carbon concrete specifications, environmental product declaration requirements for concrete and steel, using wherever possible electric construction equipment on site, and then life cycle assessments. Then, sorry to skip around here, but in Plan YC, the city's strategic climate plan passed in, released in April of 2023, we had an initiative to reduce the carbon footprint of the construction industry 50% by 2033, with a specific action embedded within that plan to implement performance-based standards for low carbon materials and equipment by 2025, which is just around the corner. And then finally, I really wanted to highlight, and I'll go on to the next one, the C40 Clean Construction Accelerator. Some of you in the room may be familiar with C40 and their clean construction program. They've been really helpful with us in capacity building within the city mayor's office side to help us kind of develop North Star goals and how to assess the way our material choice and our construction design, the way that that will impact our overall resilience to climate impacts. So I've highlighted a few of the commitments here. There are a whole slew of them, and you can find them all on our website, nyclimate.nyc.gov. But really, it accelerated our commitment as laid out in our strategic climate plan, our 50% reduction in embodied carbon commitment to 2030. So from 2033 to 2030. And that's very ambitious, and we understand that. Another initiative that I wanted to highlight here is the use of municipal purchasing power to demand zero emission construction sites from 2025 for municipal projects wherever the technology is available. So that's something we're also doing research and undertaking this fall. And then finally, on the subject of zero emissions construction sites, we want to try to push to mandate that to be a citywide requirement by 2030, wherever that technology is available as well. So I'll go through the elements of the executive order kind of bit by bit and where we stand on implementation. For low carbon concrete, we've really seen a shift to performance-based specifications from this kind of prescriptive concrete specification that you traditionally see. We see that as really best practice based on conversations we've had with industry stakeholders. I want to highlight our Department of Environmental Protection, which just this August released the city's first low carbon concrete specification, which is publicly available if anybody wants to spend their free time looking through a specification like I did. But we know that our other city capital agencies are not far behind at all in releasing their own low carbon concrete spec. DCAS, DDC, Parks, et cetera. They're really all working on this, and we expect their specifications to be released this fall and winter. I also wanted to highlight, I know there's been a lot of talk of innovations here at this conference. Really the one that we see most developed so far in New York City is the use of ground glass pozzolan as a supplementary cementitious material as opposed to fly ash or slag, which of course are fossil fuel byproducts. So we've been working a lot with our Economic Development Corporation about this, and we have research with Stony Brook University to look at marine applications of ground glass pozzolan in concrete, as New York will need to be pouring a lot of concrete to help us become more resilient to the effects of coastal flooding due to climate change. Moving on to environmental product declarations, I know these were also mentioned quite a bit today. Our EPD guidance was released in January of this year. We have assigned our applicable projects pretty broadly, so we're letting each agency decide what projects really the executive order, this element of the executive order applies to. So we're kind of saying any construction project awarded by a city agency subject to the executive order using concrete and steel need to be requesting environmental product declarations wherever possible. So you'll see the covered construction materials here, focusing on both ready mix and precast concrete, which was a recommendation from industry stakeholders to kind of push the envelope beyond ready mix into the precast world. And then on the steel side, you'll see a whole slew of different steel materials that we're really looking to gather accurate data on. And if an EPD is not available, of course, that's okay. But we want to have agencies kind of ask their suppliers why an EPD was not available and help to build that capacity from the inside. We're also, encouraging agencies to provide EPDs for other materials that are not listed here. We know that there are robust EPD ecosystems for example, like the finishings industry, but we couldn't necessarily just yet require those. So we want to see, what EPDs are on the market in New York City and what are being used in New York City capital projects before we require them beyond these two. And just a quick shout out and highlight here. I know Katie Poss from Building Transparency spoke earlier today, but we are using the EC3 tool, and she's been a wonderful help to us in really creating capacity within our city capital projects. And this is just a screenshot of the EC3 tool and has really been helpful to us in developing the infrastructure that we need, the data infrastructure to further expand our EPD requirement. So we're trying to calculate or cover the quantities of construction materials, understanding whether or not there's an EPD for that specific material. We're linking to the specific EPD so that if we did want to take a deep dive into a project, we could see that EPD. And also, EC3 has this wonderful component of their tool where there's a how to get an EPD section that we found could be very helpful, right? So if a contractor or an agency project manager is interfacing directly with a supplier and they don't have an EPD, they could go to this section within the EC3 tool and kind of give that contractor, that manufacturer, the tools that they might need to get started on their EPD generation process. Okay, this week for our office has been a really big week for electric construction equipment, and I know that might not be the general focus of this conference, but I did want to highlight this as a challenge for us and something that we've really taken on. We know that there are significant challenges to getting electric construction equipment on sites here in New York, both newly available electric construction equipment and the ones that are retrofitted and fit out. We know that in certain cities around the world, our colleague was in Oslo, Norway just last week, and I think almost 80% of their construction sites are fully electric. We know that there's infrastructure around the world for these pieces of equipment. It just needs significant love and attention in New York. And we know that there's also cost, both upfront cost issues and lifetime cost issues, and a sincere lack of communication between cities and government agencies and stakeholders within the electric construction equipment community. So we can't accurately specify, electric construction equipment just yet because we don't know what's on the market, and we don't know what's coming over the next year or two. So with those challenges in mind, we have just launched the North American Electric Construction Coalition. And so if any of you are from a New York City-based company or even anywhere else in the States, I really encourage you to check out our website. And I regret not having our QR code up here, but please reach out to me after the panel. But together with 6 other cities, New York City is launching this coalition in order to really help us spur the market and develop this market in North America. We know that cities, when they work together, have a real ability to drive impact and move markets. And collectively, as a coalition, I think we spend over $15 billion on capital construction every year. So really hoping that this coalition, and it's by no means closed, but really hoping that this coalition will help start this conversation here in New York. We also have private sector partners a part of this coalition, and you'll find that on our website. But anybody from a private sector firm to an institution to a city, we really encourage you to get on board and start having these conversations with manufacturers as the year goes on. Here are the logos and seals of all of the cities and private sector partners thus far. You'll see we have the city of Philadelphia, Boulder County, Colorado, Los Angeles, California, city of Austin, city of San Diego, Montreal, Los Angeles. I don't know if I mentioned that. And then, of course, a slew of private sector partners, which we're so happy to have on board. And then the final piece here is our life cycle assessment guidance. And I know there's a lot of conversation around life cycle assessments and the lack of standardization here, both in New York, but also in the US more broadly. And there's a lot of work being done to standardize them. So, with a grain of salt, we really released this guidance in June of this year to start having this conversation with our agencies and also in coordination with New York State and their executive order. Our life cycle assessment guidance has really been tied to existing standards, sustainability standards, so LEED, Envision, and then we have the New York City Green Schools Guide, and you can see the acceptable LCA credits here on the board. But we're really looking to get at both new construction and substantial retrofit and start to develop this really robust data set of life cycle assessments that are currently applicable under these LEED and Envision credits. Of course, when LEED version 4.1 comes out, we will update the guidance. And once New York State comes out with their LCA guidance, we'll look to standardize that and harmonize as much as possible. But we're really looking to conduct assessments of both the structure and the envelope, really getting like the bare bones of the building right now, not looking at the interior finishes MEP just yet. But you'll see here that we're looking at the structure, the foundation, and superstructure, and then for the envelope, all of the exterior cladding, including the roof. And then you've probably seen, oops, not the right slide, but that's okay. We're looking to have a 2-model system, so 2 LCAs should be conducted ideally if you're subject to this executive order, and demonstrating a 10% minimum reduction in embodied carbon as compared to a baseline model. So on a project by project level, there should be 2 LCAs. The first one, the baseline model, we're still determining when in the design process is the best opportune moment to really decide this is our baseline, but definitely in the DD phase, not in the construction design phase. As you've seen, the most embodied carbon impact can happen in that phase as early as possible in the design process. We know that at that point, you won't have specific EPDs or materials or material quantities. So we're hoping that you can use industry average EPDs, use assumptions that are kind of baked into the LCA tools that currently exist, and then iterating on that baseline model in a final model using real EPDs wherever possible, real material quantities that you will be using in your actual project. So getting closer and closer to that real final model and showing that reduction is what we really want to see. And this is what I meant to have before, but You can see here, this is a graphic from the Carbon Leadership Forum, but we're targeting this kind of yellow-orange kind of embodied carbon piece here. We're not looking quite yet at whole life carbon, synergizing the operational standards that we have on a city level with the embodied carbon standards that we're starting to build out. But we are requiring the upfront carbon stages, so the A1 to A5, the B1 to B5, and the C1 to C4. And then maybe pertinent to you all in this room is this optional reporting on the benefits of biogenic carbon or concrete carbonation in our reporting template. You'll also find on our website that we really took an approach to break apart the life cycle assessment that a tool spits out into its specific components by life cycle phase. And by separating out the biogenic carbon piece, we can really get a better understanding of what the benefit is of these biogenic materials so we can make a more accurate policy later on. But that exercise will be really critical for us in, for example, supporting the development of the mass timber industry, and of course, all of the other amazing innovations that we've heard about today. We also don't weigh in on like specific tools, which LCA tool is better than another, but we know of the tools that kind of cover the A1 to C4 section. And so those main ones in the North American industry are Athena, OneClick, and Tally. So just wanted to point that out. Okay, that's it for me.
So as I said, I'm a vice president at the New York City Economic Development Corporation, overseeing various public projects for the city of New York. EDC is the New York City's economic development arm, and our role is to strengthen the city's economy. We're a private nonprofit and ensure that our core energies such as technology, life sciences, green economy, and real estate are growing in emerging industries that build good, well-paying jobs. So I want to talk about circularity and start my talk with an idea. And that idea is that every building is a story. And I imagine everybody in this room has thought of that. And however, I think that we don't realize as an industry that even whenever we demolish a building, that story does not end. It could continue at the bottom of a landfill, or we have the chance to pick it up and continue that story to build the sustainable future we need to survive. So when approaching new development, also as an industry, we often default to ignoring the astounding amount of material resources around us. And at EDC and with these new guidelines, we really look to mine these valuable resources, capitalizing on the free materials that we get and also the free carbon. So EDC, as I mentioned, we're the city's economic development arm. We focus on four main pillars: strengthening business confidence, growing innovative sectors, focusing on equality, building neighborhoods where people live, learn, work, and play, and delivering sustainable infrastructure. So in February of this year, we released the Green Economy Action Plan. This is where we really find there's an enormous economic opportunity in developing the infrastructure we need to adapt to climate change. We want to harvest that investment into the growth of new companies, new jobs, and new products here in New York. And our action plan lays out 60 commitments to develop the city's green economy to 400,000 jobs by 2040, becoming the anchor of a prosperous, equitable, and just future for New Yorkers. The green economy sector is projected to contribute $89 billion annually to the city's GDP, up from $24 billion in 2021. So to give some quick background, I know a lot of folks in this room know a lot of these facts and figures, but operational carbon is something that we target through some other programs, including 80 by 50 as a partnership with the New York City DCAS. But with the circular construction guidelines, we're really focusing on the embodied carbon, which is 30% of carbon emissions coming from buildings. At the bottom, I think we're all familiar that construction and demolition waste is a big part of solid waste stream global-wide, and concrete production and steel production really contribute to that. So our guidelines really take a materials-focused approach, and in lieu of demolition, deconstructing buildings, and in lieu of high carbon building materials like concrete and steel, buildings can use more sustainable alternatives. want to go through a few projects before we jump into the guidelines to show how we sort of led up to this. And Red Hook Library, which is under construction right now, is one of our earlier examples. And in this project, at the top, you can see the existing library and the bottom rendering of how it's going to turn out. We sought to use as much of the concrete structure as possible. This is in Red Hook, and many of us know that's in a floodplain, and we had to raise the floor level of the building roughly 18 inches, and then have a flood wall beyond that around the building, another 18 inches. And so doing that, if you raise that up, of course, you would have a pretty low space between the roof and the floor. So we had to figure out a way to raise up the roof as well. And I wanted to show this because it's a great lesson learned from trying to implement circularity principles in a project, and that's where you have to find the right contractor. Yeah. And without urban foundations and engineering, we couldn't have done this. It wouldn't have made sense financially, and it would have been too long to try to figure it out. So urban, they have already raised a theater in Times Square 30 feet up in the air, and that theater weighed about 14 million pounds, and it was 1,700 seats. They had to do that without disturbing any of the delicate plaster work. So this project was a walk in the park for them to raise this double T concrete roof up about roughly 5 feet. So that accounted for the roughly 3 feet from the floor in the flood wall, plus some more for our ceiling heights and just a new design of the library. So you can see on the right top, the large lateral braces with urban written on them, and the beginning of the jacking process of raising this roof. And then the photo on the bottom, as well as the zoomed in one, the large version of where we raised up that roof. They did this really quickly over the course of about a day and a half. And the roof actually sat on those jacks for weeks while we built the new columns, put in new foundations in some aspects. We did some helical piles. We really looked at trying to reuse the columns that you can see there, but it just proved infeasible due to the upsize in the column, as well as installing new piles under some of them. Yeah, again, the collaboration of the right contractor at the right time was key to this project. Some other folks at EDC are really trying to build up the industry so that we don't have to rely so specifically on this, but at this time, that's really what we're looking for whenever we try to implement these strategies in our projects, find the right one. This is another one of many projects where we have, but these are two kind of fun examples I wanted to show. So the Bronx Museum of the Arts is another project where we are redefining the face of this museum along Grand Concourse in the Bronx. This is a kind of a side facade over on 165th Street. And we wanted to expose the building. It had been built and rebuilt over the course of time, take off these metal panels and sort of expose the history behind it. We recently pulled the panels off and found this, which may best be described as a face only an architect could love. But the design team and myself, we are thrilled with this challenge, and we can't wait to unveil the final result. So I'll jump into our actual guidelines here. After this, some small successes on various projects, we really wanted to formalize the process and maximize the reuse of materials on our projects and reduce embodied carbon. Through some of the ideas that I was talking about at the beginning, myself and a few colleagues, shout out to Gizem Karagaz, who is here with us, we had the idea to put together these guidelines for ourselves more than anything else. And I think sometimes that's where the best products come from. And however, we did write them in a way that could be implemented by public or private agencies or building owners. And so we wanted to really stand on the shoulders of other resources like the AIA's Net Zero Waste Guidelines, ARIP's Circular Building Toolkit, and take a different approach, to create a project delivery process, really identifying the roles between the owner, designer, and builder, to build materials reuse into the project, and a clear process with accountability built in. So the guidelines really have three main aspects: goals, strategies, and deliverables. So our goals, these we thought about a lot, and looked at other municipalities across the world to find out what's achievable but also aggressive. And so we have a 75% minimum construction and demolition material diversion via hopefully reuse, ideally on site, or recycling. 95% minimum recycling and reuse of discarded concrete and soil. We really find a lot of opportunity there for those two materials. And then 25% minimum of all project materials being low carbon. And so you may ask, what does low carbon mean? And in our guidelines, we set percentage reductions based on the carbon. So it's different for concrete or aluminum or wood, other various materials and products. So strategies. Again, we wanted to differ from the AIA and ARUPS and others. It's not design-based strategies, but really process-based strategies, so that really owners and architects who don't have experience in circularity can pick these up and know how to move forward. So looking at best practices by the project stage, from pre-design all the way through construction. Again, identify those roles and responsibilities, not just within the three basic parties of owner, designer, and builder, but the project managers and individual roles between them. And then focus on how to plan for reuse, deconstruction, material sourcing, optimization, adaptive reuse, and our deliverables. So our key deliverable is a circular design and construction plan. That has three basic components. So the circularity audit, understanding what's on site and what materials we have to work with. The life cycle assessments and EPDs, so really understanding our impact. And then what we call the materials management and waste minimization tracker. And this is about accountability and going from the circularity audit to what we have on site and understanding where all of those materials are going to go and where we're tracking against our goals. So on the left, we think that we projected that through the implementation of these guidelines, we can find a significant reduction in embodied carbon on our projects. And our broad strategies are, building only what you need, building with the right materials, building efficiently. So that's not only in looking at the design of the building and the details and components, but programming of the building, and then building for long-term value. So longevity, adaptability, and ultimately a disassembly. So I'm not going to go through each one of these points, but want to illustrate the process that we've laid out across the project life cycle. So broadly, we're going from understanding our material inventory, creating strategies to maximize reuse of materials, quantifying our impact, creating the specs and contract documents to describe the work, and developing a strategy to competitively buy out the work. And then at the end, enforcing accountability in the execution of the work. So a couple of activation projects. The top one, Spark Kips Bay, is a big initiative for EDC, and it is sort of officially, unofficially our pilot project for these guidelines. And we're really excited. It's over $1 billion project, and that's only the building on the far right, which is a CUNY and New York City Public School campus put together, focused on the life sciences. And then also LMCR, the Battery, recently finished EDC project along the waterfront in the Battery, where we were able to find a 54% reduction in embodied carbon through integration of principles that we have in our guidelines. So I wanted to give a sort of sneak peek and show what's coming out of our implementation. We recently started design on Spark Kips Bay, and our design team this is what's coming out of our circularity audit. And the guidelines give some goals and direction, but every project is going to be specific. And so in our design team, Aniad and Datner together, they've been going through, and at the top, you can see where they were mapping out various materials within the campus. And then on the lower portion, the information flow going from diagrammed plans where they're marking the references of those materials, putting that into actual material schedules, and then building a digital twin Revit model, mostly for understanding the quantities and where the materials are. Part of this process is also doing probes to really quantify and qualify the ability to reuse those materials. So I'll end it here and just mention, we're going to be doing everything we can to continue the unique stories of our buildings. Everything everybody in this room agrees our survival depends on our ability to thrive in harmony with nature. And every brick, every board, every beam, every material is a piece of our planet's future, and we want to put them to use. Thank you.
Can everyone hear me? Yes, great. Hi, everyone. So I've been asked just to give, well, thank you thank you both for your great presentations. Slightly moved at the end, Zach, when you told us that every building has a story. So I'm just going to give a little bit of a bigger picture overview. I've been working with these colleagues for a couple of years now at the state, and obviously at the state it's a slightly different level. But I think there's a little bit it's interesting to see what others are doing, across the country as well as, across the world. So I'm just going to give a little bit of a flavor. So I think you've heard and you've seen probably that we're talking about, construction materials represents about 8% of the global GHG emissions global GHG emissions. And in moving to low embodied carbon materials, we're really effectively preventing the release of emissions that will contribute to our climate. And so it's urgent and we want to do it now. We also know in that context that government is a really big builder and it's a really big purchaser of materials. Our purchasing power is significant. And through our policy, we really aim to direct markets and indicate what we're looking for and how we can push for both low embodied carbon materials, but also the data transparency we need to look at to account for and accurately report what we're using and so the emissions of that. And that's typically in the form of an environmental product declaration, as Sylvie mentioned, or also an LCA. So we know in Europe, I think they use different standards like the PER and the OER, but here in America, the EPD sort of product declaration is what we mostly use. And really starting with California, who implemented the first Buy Clean California Act in 2017, the federal government, and now the dozens of states and cities across the country who've passed similar legislation. Or having bills proposed, we're really seeing a huge wave of, just like a lot of momentum in this space. Even this week at Climate Week, compared to last year at Climate Week, I was surprised to be invited to many more embodied carbon related sessions. So it's really become an important topic, and I'm glad that people are waking up to how important it is. Just quickly, I want to mention that, cities and states were doing it, but the federal government is also making a big push. It's got its own Buy Clean initiative through the Inflation Reduction Act. It's allocated large sums of money to the EPA, Environmental Protection Agency, to roll out better creation of environmental product declarations and PCRs. Which are the PCRs and the data that go, that underpin environmental product declarations. So they've given a lot of money to the EPA to ensure the market is developing across the country here. But the federal government's also given the General Services Administration, which is the agency that manages a lot of the federal government's buildings, portfolio, and assets, given them $2 billion to spend specifically on low embodied carbon materials. So they are focusing on low embodied carbon concrete, steel, asphalt, and glass. And they've also given $2 billion to the Federal Highways Administration to also do the same thing. And so the Federal Highways Administration is also, through the money dispersed to states as well, ensuring that it's being spent on low embodied carbon concrete. So I was just going to say that in addition to, I know I've talked a lot about the procurement of these materials, but there's obviously a lot of many other policy mechanisms that you can use to reduce embodied carbon concrete. Building codes was mentioned, and as we may all know, it's quite hard to get building codes updated. So props to California for doing that first in this country, but I think everyone's looking into it. But also just requiring disclosure and reporting of this data is pretty important. In some cases requiring LCA analysis to show reductions in projects, or putting in, deconstruction ordinances, which the DC has done and some other states have done as well. And just a shout out to the Carbon Leadership Forum. If you wanted to find out more about what other states or countries honestly are doing this kind of work, they have a policy tracker map. So you can go onto a website and you can see what everyone's working on. And it's pretty impressive. It covers the world. And I guess just very quickly to end on what we're doing at the state. So the state has passed 2 sets of guidelines related to embodied carbon, and it really affects our own operations, similar to the city and many other states. It's really a leading by example executive order. So our first, not to get into the detail, but our first executive order, our first guidelines are really about collecting data so that we can understand our own baseline of what we're using and what the GHG emissions related to that is. I would say it's also with that first set of guidelines, we were really trying to indicate more to the market, especially in upstate and other parts of the state, that EPDs are going to be important because we require the EPDs for concrete, steel, glass, and asphalt. So that was our first set of guidelines. And then a couple months later, we released the Buy Clean Concrete Guidelines. And there we actually put in global warming potential limits by compressive strength for concrete. And that was our first attempt to say, this is our definition of low carbon concrete. Starting January 2025, you will now have to demonstrate that the concrete that you procure for a state project meets these limits. So that's sort of similar to what you guys have to. And so we're excited to see what happens. So far, language has gone into contracts now, specs are being updated to. We have 75 agencies. To be fair, of those, only 12 actually do contracting, but that's a lot of agencies to try and roll this stuff out with. So so we're excited to see where it goes, but glad that we've made the first steps towards this, given the scale of the issue. So with that, I'm just going to ask just going to ask my colleagues a couple questions. So I'm going to start with you, Sylvie. When you were talking and describing, all the policies and the guidances you've passed, it was very clear the direction that the city is setting, and what you're aiming for. And I was just curious to know, what, in putting in these guidelines, what has it allowed you and the city to do that perhaps you weren't able to do before? How is it helping you meet your GHG emission sort of reduction targets?
Yeah, it's a good question. So as a policy shop, MOCEJ does a lot of setting goals, which is great to begin a sustainability journey. But, I came on to our team about a year and a half ago, and we had already committed to a 50% reduction by 2030, right? And so after seeing what our North Star was, we had to determine how do we get there. So really what we've done in releasing 2 rounds of guidance this year is start to lay the groundwork for that implementation for agencies. As a mayor's office, we're not on the ground, we're not contracting. That's really an agency by agency task. But really what this guidance is meant to do is kind of provide blinders for what is relevant and what is not relevant as you, as an agency, look to contract into the future. So we've been a little flexible with agencies, and I think that varies slightly between the city and the state, right? So we haven't yet set a definition of what low carbon concrete means, right? We first want agencies to grapple with their own specifications, of course, kind of shift them towards performance-based specifications, but we've let them define what their ambition looks like on an agency level. That could very well change. And I think, we're seeing trends in municipalities and states around the country where that sort of concrete definition of concrete makes sense. But so far, not yet. Same thing on the life cycle assessment side. We've really been trying to assign what a good life cycle assessment looks like, so we can do an apples to apples comparison between different tools, because there isn't a standardization yet that we would want to see on the market. So I guess to answer your question, really what these pieces of guidance do is allow us to start the conversation with agencies, because each agency is in a different place in terms of their sustainability and decarbonization journey.
Thanks for that. And so Zach, I have a question for you related to your guidance, because actually it's a very similar question, which just goes to show that we're all clearly policymakers. But my question for you is also, so you all, with EDC guidelines, also it's clear you're setting the direction, you're setting the North Star for what you want out of your projects. But how, but you, as you mentioned, you aren't really outlining any specific strategies anyone needs to take. You are outlining metrics that people need to track, against the performance of their project. So the question is, how are you, what does implementation look like for you and with your design teams?
Yeah, I mean, I like to think that we set policy, but we try to influence it. EDC is a private nonprofit that works on a contract with the city. So we are kind of in this unique position between public and private to influence the industry, but also the policy side. And so with that said, we're trying to implement as much as possible and set a model. But to answer the question of what it looks like, I mean, we admittedly are building the bike as we're riding it right now. We put together these set of guidelines from high level, and as we are working through them now, we're finding a lot of things that purposely we know aren't in there, and we almost have to invent a couple of things like, how do you cost estimate these things in a conceptual phase and schematic phase, at a time where you have to have some level of certainty, especially when you're, you have different public spending requirements of authorizations by the city. And so there's the estimating. Also, how do you set up your contractor bids in a way that allows for flexibility? So, for example, perhaps we're looking at creating unit prices for the materials that we're trying to recover, so that if the price for recovery begins to exceed the budget of what we have, we can perhaps look at alternatives, recycling, or even carting if we have to so that we don't get these bids back and have a bust. I mean, that's what everybody's fear is right now. And implementing these, like, what are you signing this up for? So I think building in that balance, building in the contingency plans is something that we're looking at. We just announced today that Skanska is selected as our CM for the Spark project, and they have a great expertise here, and we're really excited to move forward with them to implement these guidelines in an efficient and cost-effective way.
That's great. That's super exciting. I'm going to look up that announcement. So we're at a conference about biogenic and regenerative materials. And so, and we haven't talked about them. So I guess the question to you guys is, what are these materials? What are the opportunities and challenges of these materials for your policies and for your guidelines? How do you see them being used? What do you see as the challenges, the barriers, but also, what are the huge potential opportunities?
I can go first. So I mentioned this in my slides, but we're really interested to see how and when biogenic materials show up in city capital construction projects. As I mentioned in our life cycle assessment template, we're really looking to piece out what the benefit is of biogenic materials on the total GWP of a project. I think I mentioned this as well, but I don't want to give too much credit to myself. EDC has done a wonderful job over the past year, running a program called the New York City Mass Timber Studio. And we've used for the very first time this Executive Order 23 life cycle assessment guidance for the project designs for that studio. And so all of those projects, clearly in using mass timber, had a biogenic carbon benefit component. And so seeing for the very first time in a few weeks, I'm hopeful those life cycle assessments come into my office will really help us hone that life cycle assessment template and help us to reinforce what we already know, which is that mass timber helps with the overall GWP reduction of a project, but also helps us to reinforce how important biogenic carbon is as a metric for policy making into the future. So as we look to a new building code update cycle, we can use some of that data that we've collected from these model designs and show what the benefit could be from, having a more or less restrictive environment for mass timber in building code in New York City. So that's just an example.
Yeah, I think the biggest challenges for us is that it's such a young industry and these biogenic materials and alternative materials. So it feels like a lot of invention, at least in the sense of sourcing those and figuring out a way to implement them and get them into the project and comply with building code. So I feel like as the industry matures, it's going to make things easier. And I'm really glad to see the EDC taking a really proactive approach there with the Mass Timber Studio, circular guidelines, and others, so that we're trying to drive these industries at the same time, as well as what you mentioned with the purchasing power that we have. Just the department that I work in is roughly $9 billion of city money that we're overseeing on, I don't know how many projects. The Spark is one of those billions. And so, we have a lot of power and we want to use that to drive the industry. And so ideally in the next 5 to 10 years, we will have proven out these guidelines and really matured the industry better and have more potential.
Thank you. I think at this point I can open it up if anyone in the audience has a question. Oh.
Thank you. I'm curious, as you all think about building into the future in New York City, what is the calculation that you're making in terms of planning for flooding, planning for just flood mitigation, and where does that come into the whole how you construct what you construct?
I can start. So I think this came up actually on a panel that I was on yesterday as well. There needs to be more harmonization between the climate resilience space and the embodied carbon and building construction space. I fully believe that, and that's something that I'm taking away from this climate week, to be honest. In New York City, we're currently piloting what's called the Climate Resiliency Design Guidelines, or CRDG, for city capital projects. I think about 12 or 13 projects are currently undergoing these design guidelines, which really prioritize responding to and adapting to extreme heat, flooding, climate impacts, as you mentioned. And I've been speaking to this policy advisor who's running this program. And as we look to full implementation in 2027 of these climate resiliency design guidelines, how can we pair them with the executive order and clean construction principles? And I think what we'll see as we start to see more projects grapple with both at the same time, where the harmonization can really needs to happen, where there are synergies, where they mutually reinforce each other, which I think there will be spaces where they reinforce each other, but places where there is friction, I think we really need to grapple with that as an industry, and those conversations need to be kind of melded together. So I'm glad you brought that up. More as other than conversations, not yet.
Yeah. Okay. I got a question, I guess, primarily for Sylvie. So, in what Martha said in the last presentation, where she was talking about how they had done this kind of LCA and then they had to redo it because the rules changed. I wonder, as you're developing these LCA guidelines, is there a framework that you're working with other cities and jurisdictions to kind of set of parameters and a common language? Especially, I think, right now with concrete and glass and it's relatively straightforward, but as we start to get into biogenics and into finishes and things like that, I think it's going to be really important that we're all, I know, like, think about sustainable materials in general. We've been speaking different languages for a long time, and we're trying to kind of homogenize that now. So starting as we get kind of into this nascent stage of LCAs, starting from a point of common language, I think would be important. So I'm wondering if anything's happening there.
Yeah, I would say first, informally, in developing our LCA guidance, we wanted to make sure that it was in line with the guidance that already exists coming out of the Carbon Leadership Forum. We consulted AIA in New York. And also, we drew heavily off of what other cities were already doing. So Canada is already really far ahead of us. Some municipalities specifically want to shout out the city of Vancouver and their life cycle assessment template. It heavily inspired what we ended up putting together. And I think to your point about different languages and standardization, there is a lot happening that I'm kind of tracking. I think on the ECHO project, if some of you have heard of that, I know that within the next few years, we will start to get more standardization of the inputs and the assumptions that go into these tools. And so not to let the perfect be the enemy of the good, we wanted to get these out into the world. And with the caveat, and I think this happens very often with guidance, that it updates with time. I think we definitely expect that to happen, but currently as it stands, if city projects are starting to look at their structure and envelope, not yet getting into the MEP, getting into the finishes, which we know gets a little more tricky, we think we're at a pretty solid starting point. So hope that answers your question, but I think as the industry looks to standardize, there is more attention on that, and don't want to minimize that disharmonization right now at all. But we want to start somewhere, and so this is where we are.
I could add, I mean, yeah, I would add that when it comes to LCA guidance, there's also other pathways. There is the actual using the LCA models, which, you guys have already talked about. But in the case of California, there's also, in their building codes, they have this pathway where if you reuse a certain amount of your building, then that counts essentially towards, instead of having to do a full project LCA using, over, I think it's I want to say 50% of your building, then then you're able to, you fulfill your requirement. And the other thing, the other pathway in California is also just collecting EPDs and quantities. So again, just collecting more data to get a better baseline.
So I have a question for Zach Anders, also related to guidelines. I was wondering why the EDC wanted to make their own guidelines, as you were talking about how there's more homogenization. Why were you creating your own guidelines? Was it related to having your own different strategies or approaches, since you mentioned it was partly for the EDC's own use? Did you find that there were some shortcomings with other guidelines, which is why you wanted to make it? Or I know you mentioned something about accessibility, potentially other contractors being able to use it. So I'm curious, why make your own guidelines? What was the thought process behind that? And why not use one of the pre-existing ones? Like you mentioned, the AIA has some. So, yeah.
Yeah, the AIA zero waste guidelines and the Arab circular something guidelines, they're focus much more on real design strategies, like how to design for deconstruction, how to assemble, put together material assemblies. And so we weren't interested in what was really going to benefit our architects. But as an agency, again, we did it for ourselves first off, because we're the group of us, we're really interested in implementing circularity and material reuse on our projects. And we didn't want to wait 5 to 10 years to have a few projects churn out to have some lessons learned and implement them. We wanted to jump that 5 years ahead and start doing it tomorrow, today. And so we hired, shout out to Jacobs, to put together these guidelines. And so we really looked at the process, and that's what was missing. And that's not a part of those other guidelines, really looking at the project lifecycle process, what does the owner need to do and step up and commit to versus the designer versus the contractor. Some of it may be a little bit implied in those other guidelines, but it's not a real process. So, as we're putting them together for ourselves, we were realizing this could be applicable to other agencies and even building owners. Anyone who designs a project before they build it could put these into use. So, yeah, that was our thought process. It was really for us, and it's much more, again, about the process rather than the real strategies. We stood on the shoulders of those other guidelines, and we wanted it to complement those. We didn't want to replace it. So really have ours stand up as what is a process through design and creating accountability, and then use those other guidelines to explain the how, or to figure out the how.
And if I could just add, those guidelines have been incredibly helpful to us on a city level already. EDC is not like a city capital agency as defined in Executive Order 23. So they operate in a more nimble way than a lot of other city agencies. And all of our capital construction agencies have signaled an interest in construction and demolition waste reduction, in circularity. And so these guidelines really help us, and especially those goals like 75% reduction in construction demolition waste. That really helps us as we start conversations with agencies into the fall, into the winter. Now that these guidelines are really out and public, it sets a standard for other agencies to meet. So in a lot of ways, it's a push and pull within the city, and within actors like EDC, we're really grateful to those pieces of policy and guidelines that help push us further.
I'm hearing a lot about deconstruction, and there were people involved in deconstruction, 2001, 2002, that didn't last very long. The problem they gave was that that deconstruction takes too long, right? Time is money, and they didn't want to have to wait for all the time it takes to deconstruct. They just wanted to demolish the building and get going. So how did you deal with that now?
We're proving it out, really. And that's something that we weigh the carting costs and other costs related to throwing materials away versus keeping it on site and processing it ideally on site and reusing it. So I think the quick answer is that we're trying to prove that out right now. And through some studies that we've done and initial projections, we do feel that there can be an efficient way to doing this. Doesn't mean that we're going to avoid throwing away every piece on site, but seeking to maximize that. So it's something that we're really figuring out. Again, building the bike as we're trying to ride it, but the Spark Kips Bay project, of which we are going to deconstruct an entire city block of building stock, we'll see how we turn out.
I'd also argue that, yes, time is money, but also carbon emissions is also money, and we need to reduce those now.
All right, we have time for one more question.
Okay, I'm super curious about the electric construction vehicle. If you could give us a little flavor of what you're expecting next from that, because I'm hearing like construction emissions, A5 is like 5%, but actually we're not tracking it well enough. So it's more like 20%. So.
Yeah, happy to elaborate on that. It's currently my most exciting initiative that I'm working on. So thank you for asking. What we've found is exactly your point. Like, we don't exactly know how to track A5 emissions for our city capital projects. We could go into all of the gallons of fuel that we're getting on each construction site, and then we could try to get to the electricity bills for the pieces that are electric. There are generators, but mainly from an environmental justice lens, we know every single person in this city has a construction site within 2, 3, 4 blocks from their apartment. They're loud, noisy, they're polluting. It's an issue for both construction workers and for neighborhood residents alike. So as we think about environmental justice and really the emissions that are occurring within the 5 boroughs, this is a piece where embodied carbon really overlays with the operational piece. What's next for this initiative? We're still building out this coalition, so we're in an active kind of phase of solicitation. So if your organization is a developer, an architecture firm, a thought leader, we want to engage with you. We would love to have you on board, pushing from your side of this puzzle for electric construction equipment with your clients, just as we are hoping to do as a city with our projects. So needing kind of that energy and excitement about this issue from both sides is something that we're really looking to do right now, sending that signal. Right now, we're doing a really comprehensive inventory on the city side of all of the pieces of electric construction equipment currently available on the market in the New York region, which requires a lot of one-on-one calls with equipment rental companies and the Bobcats and the Volvos and the John Deeres of the world. So once we have that kind of inventory ready, we're going to be sharing that out. with our coalition and getting feedback. Did we miss anything? And we really want to have a tool, a resource of what is available, because that doesn't yet exist across companies. So as you know, there are in electric vehicles and on-road kind of transportation, there isn't yet in this off-road and construction equipment sector. And then of course we're pushing on the state and other federal levels for incentives. I think that's another piece here. So a part of this coalition is meant to kind of signal interest in additional incentives for these pieces of equipment that currently cost more upfront, though the life cycle cost has kind of shown to be less over time than compared to like a traditional fossil fuel powered piece of equipment. It's that first upfront cost that really matters. So incentives will be key here, in addition to pilot projects, in addition to this coalition. So we want everybody on board. We want to do this inventory. We want to put it out there, starting to do pilot projects in 2025. We've seen some interest from developers and from construction companies. So if you're a part of that group, we'd love to talk to you about pilot projects, either on city projects or on private projects within the 5 boroughs. Once we show that something is able to be done, other people will feel more comfortable doing it, that kind of de-risking narrative that you hear all the time with climate tech. So we want to do that in this industry.